Hello, and welcome to another edition of Loremaker's Guide to the Galaxy, where we give you an inside look at the layout, history, and background of the lore of one of the many star systems you'll find in Star Citizen. My name is Dave Haddock. I am the lead writer over here at Cloud Imperium Games, and I am going to be your guide today through the Stanton System. That's right, you've been hearing the name. If you've been keeping track of 3.0 development and are intimately familiar with a small section of it, if you've been playing the PU live, because that takes place entirely around Stanton 2, also known as Crusader. And anyway, so as with all the talk of 3.0 and stuff like that, it just seemed like a good opportunity to kind of take a comprehensive look at the system, and for those of you who aren't familiar with sort of the background of it, give you sort of a high-level, broad overview of the system and planets. And we're toying with the idea of doing a more specialized kind of deep dive into each individual planet, which would consist of like the planet itself, the moon, the landing zone, and the stations that are around it a little bit later. So we'll keep you posted on that. But first, I figure we could start, like we usually do, just sort of talk about the creation of the system itself. This was another old system. It was actually I think it was done in 2012 originally. It was one of the system unlocks. And I actually copy and pasted the initial pitch of for the system that Ben and I discussed back in an email exchange. And it's fairly simple, as we were coming up with a lot of systems at the time. Basically, in a nutshell, it is, quote, massive super-Earth planets terraformed solely for their resources. Though they technically fall under UEE control, they were sold off to corporations to help fund the synth world, and the corps are going to bleed the planets for every cent that they're worth. Now, obviously some of that has changed since then, but the core of the idea is basically still there. The idea being that Stanton System is technically a UEE system, but is actually controlled by private corporations. So to go into some of the history, the system itself was being credited with being discovered by Toshi Aaron in 2903, which is relatively recent, but there's actually some debate about it. Basically, the story was that there had been groups of settlers who had known about the system previous to its discovery and had moved into the system before the UEE had even realized that it was there. So when Toshi discovered it, basically there had already been some outposts set up and stuff like that. But since technically he was the first person to sell the jump point route to the UEE, he was credited with its discovery, and sort of worse off for the settlers, they didn't have any rights to the land that they were inhabiting when the UEE surveyors came in to assess the system. But what they found there, and the reason probably why there was a lot of settlers there, was a really, really interesting sort of cosmic setup, if we want to talk about that. So we'll jump right into our handy star map here and have a look at the system itself. So right now we are looking at Earth. Zoom out, turn on jump points. Okay. So there's the Sol system here. And I'm going to 2D just to make it a little easier. And Stanton System is over here. So sort of again in the grand scheme of things, you have Vandal systems over here, Terra's here, Xian systems are sort of up in this area, Banu's down here, and so Stanton is right here. You can see right now that the jump points, it's connected to Terra, Magnus system, and Pyro. And interesting little fun fact, this actually wasn't its original position in the star map. I think it was actually here, maybe it was here, but ended up getting changed in what I like to call the great restructuring of I think it was 2014 or something like that. We had to do a reshuffle of the star map. It was a dangerous time. Anyway, so when the UEE, getting back to our history, when the UEE entered what would be known as the Stanton System, what was it that they found that was super interesting? Well, let's have a quick look. So go in here, and you have 4 planets, basically all within the green zone of the star. So they are all basically habitable planets, or at least would require like kind of a minimal terraforming thing. And I like to call them basically turnkey planets. So basically they were kind of ready to move in type thing. So that was very, very beneficial for the UE at the time, because at that time they were actually kind of having money problems. There was a thing called Project Archangel, which was also more commonly known as the Synth World, which was the government's attempt to sort of wash away the sins of the past through kind of terraforming horribleness and create a planet from scratch. The idea being that if they can create a planet, they won't ever have to sort of deal with the sort of moral quandary of terraforming again, which is a sweet idea, but unfortunately it's been vacuuming up money at sort of a staggering rate. So, I mean, you take that and put it on top of sort of their struggles with the Vandal, fighting crime, general infrastructure needs, this is a massive government with, planets and stuff like that under their control. It was fairly obvious that they basically were hurting. And what they could use was a financial windfall. So the government was sort of struggling with what to do with the system for a while, because they couldn't really afford to kind of start developing this thing on its own. So the government came up with an idea that was equally called ingenious and despicable in the same Senate session. And that plan was to sell the planets to corporations who would undertake the financial responsibilities to maintain and develop the worlds. So obviously that was a very radical idea, never been done before, and obviously had a huge amount of again, moral, ethical, social, political implications and stuff like that. So it required a lot of conversation, but they ended up kind of going through with it and sold the planets to 4 mega corporations. So we'll quickly go over them. There's Hurston Dynamics, who was sort of a very long time weapons manufacturer. Crusader Industries, who makes Starliners. ArcCorp, who is sort of a amorphous conglomerate megacorp. They're known for sort of fusion engines and I think some mining and terraforming, but they just absorb companies, basically. They're like the Blob. And Microtech on the very edge, who make Moby-Glass. So everybody has a Moby-Glass, so you can imagine how rich they are. So anyway, again, this was totally new territory for them. So there's a lot of time spent sort of hammering out the specifics of the sale and how would this work and responsibilities of the companies that they would need to adhere to and stuff like that. And I mean, because it's technically a UEE system, the corporations were required, just like every planet, even if it's recognized or not, is required to adhere to what's known as the common laws, which are basically the fundamental personal freedoms enjoyed by everybody in the UEE. It doesn't matter if you're a citizen, civilian, whatever. If you're living in the UEE, you are protected by common laws, which kind of cover like standardized safety practices for structures, products, health services, basic education, trade, travel, and security are them in a nutshell. The trade-off for it was, I mentioned earlier, the recognized planets. The planets in Stanton System would, by their very nature, would never be allowed to be recognized, which basically meant that they could never be represented in the Senate. And the idea behind that was that, if, say for example, they allowed them to have a senator, that senator would be more beholden to the corporation who sent them there than to the sort of the population of the planet. So they basically were like, there's no way that they would be that impartial, so they just basically took it off the table, and they're like, they will never be basically recognized and represented in government. So yeah, but for those who keep up with our sort of weekly news updates, will probably know that although these sales were finalized and this happened sort of a while ago, there's still issues arise from time to time, whether sort of new scenarios or situations pop up that require them to sort of revisit, like, all right, well, how are we going to handle this? I'll add a link to the article in the description below, but that was an article we did recently that sort of talked about the crime stats in Stanton were being sort of misrepresented and sort of what the implications of that and what it meant and stuff, but I'll send a link down there. But we'll basically step through the planets of the system real quick. So first one, as I mentioned, is Hurston. Stanton 1, known locally as Hurston, but is owned by Hurston Dynamics. And they are sort of the controversial epicenter of this system. It's a family-owned corporation that has existed for centuries. They're like very old school kind of Earth money, and they've made their fortune selling weapons, so ship weapons all the way down to personal weapons and stuff like that. And so the source of this controversy is sort of twofold. One, the ecosystem of this planet has basically just been destroyed. They do not, to say that Hurston does not care about the ecosystem of the planet is probably an understatement. It has been just ripped by strip mining, heavy pollution from their massive production facilities, and they test weapons down there. So they're just blasting parts of the landscape away with new guns and bombs and missiles and all sorts of stuff. So they're kind of, they really don't care about the planet. And second, the Hurstons basically control their workers with an iron fist. Like as far as a company to work for, the Hurstons have one of the worst ones you can possibly imagine. I mean, civil rights advocates routinely chastise this corporation for the living conditions of the workers, but because the executives are sort of careful enough to adhere to the common laws, at least as far as being provable in court, they've sort of managed to escape serious punishment, but they're always kind of on the coals. But they kind of don't treat their workers well. And it's important to know also actually that there's a distinction when I'm referring to the workers' condition, because the executives at the company have a very different experience on Hurston. Those that are in sort of higher ranks within the company hierarchy, get to enjoy gated communities and amenities that are basically super luxurious than anything that the workers have access to. So obviously this has created somewhat of a huge cultural and financial divide between the two sides, and whether anything comes from this tension remains to be seen, but the executives aren't dumb and they're keeping an eye on their workers. So in a nutshell, it's a super fun place to visit, and I'm sure great for the family. So next we have, speaking of family-friendly spots, we have Crusader right here, which is actually a fun one because it's a low-mass gas giant, which I know a lot of people actually seemed befuddled by because it exists so close to the star, but I'm assured it's real. Basically, if you're asking yourself why would a company particularly want to purchase a planet that has no ground that's accessible, then you deserve a cookie, because that's a great question. The answer is that Crusader Industries, who ended up buying it, manufacture basic commercial transport ships. So they do small commuter type stuff all the way up to basically high volume or high capacity like starliners and stuff like that. So what they did is they actually used this gas giant because the atmosphere is breathable high enough that they created these sort of like extensive lattice works that are basically like floating shipyards. So they're able to construct most of their ships basically in atmosphere, which is a sort of a unique experience for them. Like it's not something that happens very commonly. So it's actually kind of perfect for them, is that they can start the construction in atmosphere and then move basically the ships off the planet to finish them up if they need to or whatever. But basically on the plus side, it creates these sort of amazing vistas, and I'm sure I can link some links to some of the concept art that's been done, but it's just beautiful, like sprawling clouds, very, very, very pretty. And so as far as the company itself, though, conversely to Hurston, who kind of treats its workers with some disdain, Crusader's the idea was that Crusader's very fixated on like making this a fun place for people to visit. I mean, they part of their money comes from travel and these starliners and stuff like that. So the idea was that it's sort of a bit of a hub. Like they want it to be a family-friendly like travel destination, but you can kind of pick up ships that can take you to different areas and stuff like that. Which, if you go back to the old page for the Genesis Starliner, you get a sense of that sort of kind of airport, starport type type thing, which is really, really fun. Now, for those of you who have been frequenting the PU or as well reading the news updates, you will know that despite all this sort of attempt to make this a very family-friendly environment, Crusader's been having a bit of a crime problem recently. They have been suffering from an outlaw pack that's known as the Nine Tails, who have recently moved in the area and have been causing some chaos. And that was the article I mentioned earlier, talking about the crime stats, was about Crusader basically kind of fudging the crime stats to make it sound not as bad as it was, and all the political fallout because of that. And just to throw out, I mean, like I said, we'll hopefully dive into this in a little more thoroughly in a later episode, but the moons of Crusader are Selen, Daymar, and Yela, are named after the three main characters of the 24th century, I think it's 24th, children's story called A Gift for Baba. And if you're a subscriber out there, you can actually read this story in the last batch of jump points we've been doing. Will actually wrote them up, and so they're there to read, and they're super fun. So I just want to give that a quick shout out. So moving along, we have the Aaron Halo, which is an asteroid belt to separate us a bit. And next we have ArcCorp. And so ArcCorp is an interesting one. There's another planet that sort of went through some changes. The original, pitch for it was that sort of Coruscant type planet where it's like just one massive megacity type thing, but we sort of walked that back a bit. It was initially described as like every square inch of it had been developed and stuff like that, but now we're sort of sticking it to land masses because there's sort of sciencey stuff that like weather and stuff like that would be affected by everything being basically a city. Anyway, but still got the same vibe, and it's the thing I really love about it. It's got that almost cyberpunky urban megacity type feel to it, which is really, really cool. But ArcCorp as a company is basically, like I mentioned earlier, it's just a conglomerate. It's just a megacorp in sort of the truest definition of the word that just absorbs other companies. It is the blob. I'll say it again. But like, if you've ever done research in sort of like massive corporations in the real world, and you see sort of like, oh, this one company owns these 150 different products and stuff like that, it can be it's very weird. And that was the type of thing that we were sort of going for with them, was that their sort of business is absorbing other businesses. But in keeping with that mentality, that's why they sort of turned this planet into a massive business and production park. They probably provide incentives and stuff like that to try and lure companies to sort of base their operations out of here and stuff like that. And one of the ideas was that in its construction, or when they were sort of initially assessing the planet and starting to plan out how they were going to build on it, that they had been inspired by the Xian factory worlds, which were sort of this idea that the Xian designate worlds for function. Like they've gotten to the point where they're like, this planet is going to be a production world, and this planet is going to be an agricultural world, and stuff, and they stick to it. Like, it's not a mishmash. They will just zone planets to serve specific functions. And so that was sort of the idea with this, was that maybe that the creators who were building it were sort of inspired by that idea of like they wanted to make a business world. The more cynical people tend to believe that the reason why they're doing it is not out of some interesting alien sort of environmental theory approach, but actually that they're just using it as a way to bring companies in so they can keep an eye on them and figure out if there's somebody that they would like to absorb. So it's one of the two. So a little background of actually ArcCorp itself. The company itself actually started out as an exploration consortium back in the 27th century, which is pretty awesome. And after several sort of failed ventures, they ended up using their sort of remaining assets to transition into acquiring mining rights for recently discovered planets. And that actually turned out to be sort of the smart move, and became much more profitable, and positioned them to basically absorb their first company, which was a terraforming outfit that they had been working with called BCK. And so from there, they basically became a mining / terraforming consortium, and now you're talking huge, huge, huge money. And but it was actually once they snagged a company called Novalight that developed fusion engines, that's what's the thing that basically they actually became known for, was the development of these sort of massive industrial fusion engines. All right, so our final planet in the system is Microtech. And if you have a look here, before we zoom in on it, you can see that it's sort of positioned on the edge of the green zone. And unfortunately for them, though, they actually had a terraforming malfunction when they were doing the sort of minimal terraforming on the planet, and ended up creating sort of like unnaturally dense clouds on the planet, which dropped the temperature. So while the planet was habitable, it became tremendously cold. But that wasn't actually a problem for Microtech. The company is a sort of, obviously it's a huge company because they bought a planet, but they created the glass technology most ubiquitously known for, the Moby glass. So the thing that literally everybody has, and is the sort of key to their personal management. They're the ones who made it. So needless to say, they are making bank. Kind of in a similar sense to ArcCorp, one of the things that they wanted to do was to create a sort of a tech haven, if you will, sort of like a mecca for technological ingenuity, cutting edge research, all that type of stuff, like just a big think tank. I mean, unfortunately, the temperature is so prohibitively cold that they have to live in sort of dome, enclosures and stuff like that. It's too cold to sort of live outside, exposed to the cold, which creates an interesting social dynamic, because basically a lot of people with cabin fever, but it's a lot of money. Like, that's the thing. It's like ArcCorp, but ArcCorp has that sort of, as I said, sort of cyberpunky, Blade Runner-y type feel to it, whereas this is, a business haven that is flush with cash. So Silicon Valley in a ski chalet, sealed off from the world. That's kind of the flavor for that thing. So it should be very interesting once we get there. It should be really fun. So that's it for this episode of Loremaker's Guide to the Galaxy. Again, this was just sort of a broad overview of the Stanton system. As I mentioned before, we want to do significantly deeper dives into the various planets and their moons and stations and stuff like that. So we'll keep you posted as we did that. And as always, I'd like to thank all of our subscribers for their support in creating this additional community engagement content like this, and Around the Verse, and Bug Smashers, and all the other shows that we do. And of course, a huge, huge thank you to all our backers, because without you, we just wouldn't be here. So that's it. I'm Dave Haddock, and I will see you next time.
Thank you for watching. So if you want to keep up with the latest and greatest in Star Citizen and Squadron 42's development, please follow us on our social media channels. See you soon.